A lady was found dead, and I feel like my prank was the cause. I never thought a stupid joke would become the first thing I confessed to a therapist, the last thing I thought about before falling asleep, and the one memory that still wakes me up in the middle of the night. People always say pranks are harmless as long as nobody gets hurt, and for most of my life I believed that. I grew up watching prank videos online, pulling practical jokes on my friends, hiding behind doors to scare my cousins, switching labels on soda bottles, and convincing people of ridiculous stories just to watch the confusion on their faces. I loved making people laugh, but I also loved getting a reaction. Looking back now, I realize there's a fine line between funny and cruel, and sometimes you don't know you've crossed it until it's far too late. I wish someone had told me that years ago. Maybe then I wouldn't be carrying this guilt around like a shadow that refuses to leave. Whether what happened was actually my fault or not, I honestly don't know anymore. All I know is that one woman lost her life, and my prank became part of the story everyone remembers. This happened almost 4 years ago, back when I was 23 and renting a tiny apartment above a convenience store. I worked evenings stocking shelves at a supermarket, which meant I usually got home close to midnight. My neighborhood wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't exactly peaceful either. It was one of those places where everybody knew each other's faces without ever learning each other's names. Elderly couples walked their dogs every morning. Kids played soccer in the parking lot until someone yelled at them for kicking the ball into parked cars. Every Friday night someone had music blasting from their balcony, and every Monday morning everyone pretended they hadn't heard it. Life was predictable, comfortable. Quiet enough that even the smallest unusual event became neighborhood gossip within hours. Across the hallway from me lived an older woman named Margaret. I didn't know her well at first. She was probably in her late 60s, always wore cardigans regardless of the weather, and carried reusable grocery bags everywhere she went. She smiled at everyone, even people who ignored her. The first real conversation we had happened because my grocery bag split open on the stairs and canned food rolled everywhere. Before I could even react, she was already kneeling down, helping me pick everything up. She joked that gravity seemed to enjoy embarrassing young people. I laughed harder than the joke deserved, mostly because she reminded me of my grandmother. From that day on, we'd exchange greetings almost every evening. Sometimes she'd ask how work was going. Sometimes she'd complain about her knees or tell me about the flowers she was trying to grow on her balcony. She was the kind of neighbor who made an apartment building feel less lonely. There was only one thing everyone knew about Margaret: she was incredibly nervous whenever anything strange happened. If someone knocked on her door unexpectedly, she'd peek through the peephole 3 or 4 times before opening it. If she heard footsteps outside late at night, she'd wait until they disappeared before unlocking her door. One evening the fire alarm went off because someone burned dinner, and she looked genuinely terrified until firefighters explained it was a false alarm. Some neighbors teased her behind her back, saying she watched too many crime shows. Others were more sympathetic, guessing she'd probably gone through something difficult years earlier. Nobody knew the truth because she never talked about it. Around that same time, my best friend Tyler had become obsessed with filming harmless pranks for social media. This was before every other person online was trying to go viral, so it actually felt new back then. We'd spend weekends recording silly videos, pretending to lose imaginary dogs, wearing ridiculous disguises, or hiding Bluetooth speakers in random places to make it sound like someone was whispering nearby. Most of our videos barely got any views, but we had fun making them. We never destroyed property, never physically touched anyone, and if someone looked genuinely upset, we'd immediately explain the joke and apologize. At least that's what we told ourselves. Looking back, we were mostly thinking about getting a reaction, not whether people wanted to be part of our entertainment. One Friday evening, Tyler showed up carrying a small motion-activated speaker he'd ordered online. It was about the size of a hockey puck and could play any sound whenever someone walked past it. He had programmed creepy whispering into it. The recording simply said, "Don't look behind you," in a soft voice that almost sounded human. The idea was to hide it in bushes near a walking trail and capture people's confused reactions from a distance. We tested it in my apartment hallway, and I won't lie, it scared me too. Even knowing it was fake, hearing a whisper when nobody was around made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Tyler laughed so hard he nearly dropped the camera. We should have left it at that. Instead, Tyler suggested placing the speaker somewhere inside our apartment building because we'd get better reactions. I immediately hesitated. Outside was one thing. Inside felt different because we'd be pranking neighbors who actually lived there. But Tyler insisted it would only be there for a few minutes. We'd record 1 or 2 reactions, retrieve the speaker, and call it a night. "Nobody's getting hurt," he kept saying. "It's literally just a whisper." Against my better judgment, I agreed. It's amazing how often bad decisions begin with someone saying, "Come on, it'll be funny." Around 10 that night, we hid the speaker behind a decorative plant near the stairwell between the 2nd and 3rd floors. It was almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Then we waited at the far end of the hallway where the security camera couldn't easily see us. The first person to trigger it was a college student carrying laundry. The whisper played, and he froze for about 2 seconds before looking around with a confused expression. He shrugged and kept walking. Tyler nearly fell over laughing. Next came a middle-aged man who looked annoyed more than frightened. He searched the hallway for a moment, muttered something under his breath and walked into his apartment. We whispered to each other that we'd gotten enough footage and should probably pack up. That's when the elevator doors opened. Margaret stepped out carrying 2 grocery bags that looked heavier than usual. I remember every tiny detail because my brain has replayed the moment thousands of times. She was wearing the same blue cardigan she'd worn earlier that week. One bag had a loaf of bread sticking out the top. She looked tired but smiled anyway when she noticed us standing down the hallway. Before I could wave back or warn her, she started walking toward the stairs. The speaker activated. "Don't look behind you." Margaret stopped so suddenly that one of her grocery bags slipped from her hand. An orange rolled across the floor. She slowly turned her head over one shoulder, her face instantly draining of color. Then she looked toward the empty hallway where the whisper had seemed to come from. I could see confusion changing into genuine fear in a matter of seconds. She wasn't reacting like everyone else had. She looked absolutely terrified. I immediately stepped out from where we were hiding. "Margaret," I called out. "Wait," she startled again, spun toward my voice, and for one horrifying second it looked like she didn't recognize me. Tyler rushed over holding the speaker in his hand and started apologizing before either of us could explain. We told her it was a prank, showed her the tiny device, and even played the recording again to prove it wasn't a real person hiding nearby. She tried to laugh, she really did, but it wasn't convincing. Her hands were shaking so badly that I picked up her groceries for her. She thanked me in a voice that sounded much quieter than usual. She said, "You boys gave an old woman quite a fright," followed by a weak smile that disappeared almost immediately. I apologized at least 5 times before walking her to her apartment door. She insisted she was fine. She even said, "Don't worry, I'll be laughing about this tomorrow." But before she went inside, she paused. She looked directly at me with an expression I'll never forget. Then she quietly said, "Some people don't recover from being frightened as easily as others." Felt strangely
The door
quiet.
closed.
Tyler and I stood in silence for a long moment.
Even he didn't sound
Neither of us
convinced
felt
by
like
his own
laughing
words.
anymore. Usually after filming a prank, we'd spend an hour rewatching the footage, laughing at the reactions, talking about what we could do differently next time. That night, neither of us even bothered to transfer the videos from the camera. The memory card stayed inside the camera, tossed carelessly onto my coffee table, while we sat in silence listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. Every now and then one of us would start to say something before deciding against it. Margaret's last sentence kept repeating in my head. "Some people don't recover from being frightened as easily as others." It wasn't what she said that unsettled me, it was the way she said it, almost like she wasn't talking about herself alone but about something she'd spent years trying to escape. Tyler eventually stood up, stretched, and grabbed his backpack. "She's okay," he said, more to reassure himself than me. She smiled, she wasn't angry, we apologized, end of story. I nodded even though I didn't believe it. He gave me a quick pat on the shoulder before heading downstairs, and I watched him drive away from my window. The apartment suddenly felt much emptier. I kept thinking about knocking on Margaret's door one more time just to make sure she was all right, but it was already close to 11:30. I figured she was probably asleep or at least trying to be. The last thing she needed was another unexpected knock on her door after everything that had happened. So instead, I made myself a cup of coffee I didn't even want, turned on the television for background noise, and spent half the night staring at a screen without actually watching anything. The next morning I overslept. Saturdays were my only real chance to relax, so I wasn't surprised when I woke up just after 10. I made breakfast, stepped onto my tiny balcony with a mug of coffee, and noticed Margaret's curtains were still closed. Normally by that time she'd already be outside watering the flowers she'd lined up along her railing. She treated those flowers like family, talking to them whenever she thought nobody was listening. I smiled at the thought, figuring maybe she'd simply decided to sleep in after our stupid prank. I even considered buying her fresh flowers as another apology later that afternoon. Looking back now, I wish I had walked across the hallway right then instead of assuming everything was fine. Around lunchtime I bumped into another neighbor named Denise while checking my mailbox. She was balancing a stack of packages in her arms and casually asked if I'd seen Margaret that morning because she hadn't answered her phone. I shrugged and told her I hadn't. Denise frowned but didn't seem overly concerned. "She's probably reading one of those mystery novels again," she joked. "When she's reading, the rest of the world disappears." We both laughed lightly before going our separate ways. At the time, it felt like such an ordinary conversation that I barely thought about it afterward. Later that evening, I finally worked up the courage to knock on Margaret's door. I had stopped by a florist after work and bought a small bouquet of yellow daisies because I remembered her once saying they reminded her of happier days. I stood outside her apartment for almost a minute before knocking softly. No answer. I waited and knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. I leaned closer to the door and thought I heard the television playing faintly inside, but it was impossible to tell. I told myself she must have gone out and forgot to switch it off. Feeling awkward, I left the flowers by her doorstep with a handwritten note that simply read, "I'm really sorry about last night, I hope you can forgive us. Your neighbor." Sunday came and went without any sign of her. The bouquet remained exactly where I'd left it. By Monday morning, the flowers had already started to droop from the winter air. That's when the uneasy feeling in my stomach returned. Margaret wasn't the type to leave home for days without telling somebody, especially not without bringing her plants inside. Even her mailbox had begun filling with unopened letters. Several neighbors noticed, but everyone had a different explanation. Maybe she'd gone to visit family. Maybe she'd been admitted to the hospital for something minor. Maybe she'd simply wanted a weekend away. Nobody imagined anything worse because none of us wanted to. Tuesday afternoon, I was halfway through stocking shelves at work when my phone buzzed repeatedly. It was Tyler calling. I ignored it at first since I was supposed to use my phone during shifts, but he called again immediately. Then again. My manager noticed the screen lighting up and told me to answer in case it was an emergency. The second I picked up, I knew something was wrong. Tyler wasn't the kind of person who panicked easily, but his breathing sounded uneven. "You at work?" he asked. "Yeah, why? You need to come home." "What happened?" There was a long pause before he answered. "They found Margaret." I felt my entire body go cold. "What do you mean they found her?" They found her in her apartment this morning." I remember gripping the shelf so tightly that canned soup started falling onto the floor. My manager asked if I was alright, but his voice sounded distant, almost underwater. I couldn't process what Tyler was saying. "Is she okay?" Another silence. "No." That single word hit me harder than anything I've ever heard. I don't even remember leaving work. One minute I was standing in the supermarket aisle, and the next I was pulling into the apartment parking lot where 3 police cars and an ambulance were already parked outside. Yellow tape blocked off the entrance to the building. Small groups of neighbors stood together whispering, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. I spotted Denise wiping tears from her face while talking to an officer. Someone else quietly said they'd found Margaret in her bedroom after a maintenance worker noticed newspapers piling up outside her door and reported it to the building manager. Nobody knew exactly what had happened. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some people claimed she'd suffered a heart attack. Others whispered she'd fallen during the night. Someone even suggested there had been a break-in, though police quickly dismissed that idea. All anyone knew for certain was that she was gone. As I stood there staring at the building, Tyler walked over to me. His face was pale. "I didn't tell them about the prank," he whispered. I looked at him in disbelief. "What? I didn't think it mattered." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You don't think it matters?" He rubbed both hands over his face. "What if it had nothing to do with this? We'd just be making ourselves look guilty." His words made sense. And somehow that terrified me even more. Because for the first time since that night, I realized I wasn't just wondering whether our prank had frightened Margaret. I was wondering whether it had been the last thing that pushed her over the edge. Neither of us said another word as investigators continued moving in and out of the building. Then I overheard something that made my blood run cold. An older man from the first floor quietly told another neighbor, "Poor Margaret. After everything she'd survived before, this is such a tragic ending." I immediately turned toward him. "What do you mean, survived before?" The man looked surprised. I'd never heard. "You didn't know?" I slowly shook my head. He sighed heavily before answering. "About 15 years ago, someone broke into her old house." He paused, looking down at the pavement. "They terrorized her for hours before the police arrived." I felt every muscle in my body freeze. The old man continued quietly. "She never really recovered after that night, and in that every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Margaret standing in the hallway, my head louder than ever, smiling at me 1 second and recover from being frightened as easily as others. My mind kept replaying the whisper from that tiny speaker over and over again. "Don't look behind you." It had been nothing more than a pre-recorded sound to us, but to someone carrying years of unresolved trauma, maybe it sounded like something far more sinister. I couldn't stop wondering what went through her mind after she closed her apartment door. Did she sit awake all night? Did she relive memories she'd spent years trying to bury, or had the prank simply become an unfortunate coincidence that I was unfairly attaching to her death? I wanted answers, but I was equally terrified of finding them. The following day, Tyler and I made a decision that neither of us wanted to make. We walked into the local police station and asked to speak with the detective handling Margaret's case. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely fill out the visitor form. When the detective invited us into his office, I immediately confessed everything. I explained how we'd hidden the motion-activated speaker, what sound it played, how Margaret reacted, how we'd apologized afterward, and how guilty we'd felt ever since. I even offered him the camera and the original footage. The detective listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting down notes before finally asking for the memory card. He thanked us for coming forward instead of waiting to be questioned. Then he said something that has stayed with me ever since. "You'd be surprised how many people avoid telling us things because they're afraid they'll get blamed. Sometimes information helps, sometimes it doesn't, but hiding it almost never makes things better." For nearly 2 weeks we heard nothing. Every day I expected a phone call asking us to return for more questioning. Every knock on my apartment door made my heart race. Friends noticed I'd become distant. I stopped laughing. I stopped watching prank videos altogether. I couldn't even hear someone jokingly say, "Got you," without feeling sick. My apartment, which had once been full of camera equipment and ridiculous prank ideas scribbled on sticky notes, suddenly felt like a museum dedicated to the dumbest version of myself. Eventually the detective called. He asked us to come back to the station. I honestly believed we were about to be arrested. Instead, he sat us down and carefully explained what the medical examiner had concluded. Margaret had suffered a severe brain aneurysm sometime during the night after we saw her. According to the doctors, it was something that had likely been developing for years without her knowledge. There were no signs of assault, no evidence of foul play, and nothing to suggest another person had directly caused her death. The detective made it clear that aneurysms can happen suddenly and without warning, even in people who appear perfectly healthy. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I asked the question that had been haunting me. Did the prank cause it? The detective didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "There's no medical evidence proving that your prank caused her aneurysm. Stress can affect the body in many ways, but there's simply no way for anyone to honestly say this happened because of what you did." That sentence should have freed me. It didn't, because there was another part he added afterward. "What I can tell you is that your prank frightened her. Whether it changed the outcome is something nobody can ever know. Nobody can ever know." Those words became my prison. Weeks later, Margaret's niece knocked on my apartment door. I'd never met her before. For a split second, I thought she'd come to yell at me after hearing about the prank. Instead, she handed me a small cardboard box. "My aunt wanted you to have these." I looked at her in confusion. "Me?" She smiled sadly. "She talked about you more than you probably realized. She said you reminded her of the grandson she never had." I felt my throat tighten. Inside the box were gardening gloves, a few old photographs of Margaret standing beside the flowers she'd loved so much, and a folded envelope with my name written across the front in neat handwriting. The letter had been written months before she died. It wasn't specifically meant for me. It was one of several letters she'd prepared in case something ever happened to her unexpectedly. Near the end, though, she had added a handwritten note. "To my neighbor, thank you for always carrying my groceries when my knees hurt, even when I pretended I didn't need help. Never lose your kind heart. Everyone makes mistakes. Don't let one mistake become your whole life." I completely broke down. She never mentioned the prank, not once. She remembered my kindness instead. That hurt even more. After her funeral, Tyler and I permanently deleted every prank video we'd ever made. We sold most of our camera gear and donated the money to a local organization that helped elderly people living alone. Every spring since then, I've planted yellow daisies outside my new home because they remind me of Margaret's balcony. Whenever I water them, I think about how easy it is to forget that every stranger we meet is carrying a story we'll probably never know. Trauma doesn't always leave visible scars. Sometimes the strongest-looking people are quietly fighting battles nobody else can see. I still don't know whether my prank had anything to do with Margaret's death. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it simply happened on the worst possible night. But I no longer ask myself whether I legally caused what happened. I ask a different question. Would I ever want another person to feel the kind of fear I saw in her eyes that evening? The answer is no. Not for a laugh, not for views, not for anything. That single moment changed the way I treat people forever. If this confession has taught me anything, it's that kindness is almost never something you'll regret, but making entertainment out of someone else's fear just might become the memory you carry for the rest of your life. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment for more crazy confessions I get from people.